Okay, so picture this. You're trying to argue that you could have a face-to-face chat with someone who died centuries ago. And I'm not talking about in a dream, I mean while you're wide awake. Sounds wild, right? Well, that is the exact and pretty controversial claim made by a 15th century scholar, Jalal al-Din al-Suyuti. And we're going to unpack his absolutely fascinating argument for how that could even be possible.
So let's just start with the core question here, because it's a real mind-bender. Can you actually see someone who died centuries ago while you're completely, totally awake? Again, we're not talking about a dream here. This is about a real, conscious experience. And this very idea, it sparked a major debate, and that's exactly what we're digging into.
And here's our guide for this whole journey, Al-Suyuti himself, basically laying out his mission statement. He says, look, a lot of people were asking about this, but a bunch of scholars just flat out rejected the idea. They called it impossible. So in response, he wrote this little booklet to make his case. He called it Tanwir al-Halak, which means something like the illumination of the gloom.
All right, Section 1, a controversial vision. So what was this big debate that made him feel like he had to write this book in the first place? You see, for him, this wasn't just some abstract academic debate. Al-Suyuti was really pushing back, and pushing back hard, against this specific idea that was gaining ground. The claim that seeing prophets or even angels while you're wide awake was just impossible. He saw this as, a pretty dangerous denial of what the scripture said and what many deeply pious people had actually experienced.
Okay, moving on to Section 2, the prophetic promise. So Al-Suyuti builds his entire argument on a single, really powerful foundation, a direct promise that's attributed to the Prophet Muhammad himself.
And this right here, this is the cornerstone of his whole case. It's a famous prophetic tradition, what's known as a hadith, which is a recorded saying of the Prophet, and it creates this direct link. Whoever sees me in a dream will see me in a waking state. Simple enough, right? Well, as you can probably guess, the real fight is all about what that second part, will see me in a waking state, actually means.
And this is where the core disagreement really comes into focus. You've got two camps. On one side, you have scholars who said, oh, we'll see me in a waking state just means you'll see him on the day of judgment. But Al-Suyuti comes back with a pretty sharp objection. He says, wait a minute, all believers expect to see him then, so that doesn't make this a special promise. He argues for the second interpretation, that this is a literal promise of a waking vision right here in this life, a unique spiritual gift.
Section 3, accounts of waking sight. So, once he's laid out the textual proof, Al-Suyuti shifts gears. He moves on to his next line of evidence, stories from people who claim this actually happened to them.
But before he even gets to visions of the prophet, he sets a precedent. He kind of says, hey, hold on. Seeing heavenly beings isn't some new, crazy idea. He points to the prophet's own companions. He tells this incredible story about a companion named Imran ibn Husayn, who said angels would literally greet him out loud. But then, get this, when he used a medical treatment called cauterization, which some saw as a lack of perfect trust in God, the greetings stopped. Dead silence. And only when he gave it up did they come back. And he wasn't alone. Other famous companions also reported seeing the angel Gabriel. The message was pretty clear. That line between our world and the spiritual one, it wasn't always so solid.
So Al-Suyuti is using these stories to build a logical bridge. He's basically asking, if the very first generation of Muslims could see angels, why would that ability just vanish? And more to the point, why would it only apply to angels and not to the Prophet himself?
And to really drive this home, he tells this amazing story about one of the most beloved figures in Sufism, Sheikh Abdul Qadir al-Jilani. So the sheikh is in Baghdad, right? But he's hesitant to get up and preach. He feels like he's not eloquent enough, that he's just a non-Arab who can't speak to these sophisticated city scholars. He's totally filled with self-doubt.
And then he has a vision. According to the account, he saw the Prophet himself right before the noon prayer, and the Prophet asks him, "My son, why don't you speak?" When the sheikh explains his insecurity, the Prophet tells him, "Open your mouth." And as the story goes, when he did, the Prophet spat in it 7 times.
And the impact of this vision was apparently immediate. It was totally transformative. After that experience, Sheikh Abdul Qadir gets up to speak, and suddenly these words of incredible wisdom and eloquence just pour out of him. And that moment is seen as the launch of his legendary career, becoming one of the most influential preachers in Islamic history.
And the stories get even more intense. Al-Suyuti brings up another famous mystic, Sheikh Abu al-Abbas al-Morsi, who made this I mean, it's just a staggering claim. For this sheikh, the waking vision wasn't some rare once-in-a-lifetime thing. No, it was a constant, unbroken reality. It was so central to his faith that he said if he couldn't see the Prophet for even the blink of an eye, he wouldn't even consider himself a Muslim anymore. Just, wow.
All right, part 4, explaining the impossible. Now, after hearing all these stories, you might be thinking exactly what the skeptics back then were thinking. Okay, but how? How is any of this even possible? So let's get into the theological mechanics that Al-Suyuti lays out.
This right here is the central objection. The critics would say, look, a living person exists in what we call the abode of annihilation. That's our physical world. But the prophet is in the abode of eternity. These are two completely separate realms. So the question is, how on earth can someone in one place see into the other?
Well, Suyuti basically takes that objection and dismantles it with a 3-step framework. Step 1, he argues that prophets aren't dead in the way we think of it. They're considered alive in their graves. Step 2, because they're alive, their spirit and their body can move beyond physical space. They aren't just stuck in their tombs. And step 3, and this is the absolute key, God can simply lift the veil, the barrier that separates our world from theirs for anyone he chooses. And when that veil is lifted, a vision can happen. To really explain what this experience is like, Al-Suyuti brings in this concept of the barzakh. Think of the barzakh as this intermediary state, a realm that's between our physical world and the afterlife. So he argues the vision isn't like seeing your friend across the room. It's a barzakhiya state. It's like you're temporarily stepping into a different kind of spiritual reality, one that doesn't follow our normal rules of physics.
And he makes one last, really critical point. He says, this isn't a vision of a ghost, or a memory, or some kind of symbol of the prophet. No, the people who believe this happened, they believe the person is seeing the prophet's true self, his actual body and his spirit, together, made visible through an act of divine mercy.
So, Section 5, a living connection? What does all this really add up to? You know, beyond the intricate theological arguments, why does this matter so much?
Well, the biggest takeaway is this. For Al-Suyuti and the mystics he's quoting, the prophet isn't just some historical figure who is sealed away in the past. This belief completely transforms history into a living, breathing, accessible reality, where a direct, personal connection with the founder of your faith, well, that remains a real possibility.
And that really leaves us with a final question to chew on. What actually changes? How does it change the very fabric of a faith when you believe its founder isn't just a memory to be honored, but a presence that can, for some, still be met face to face right here and now?